Please take this, sir. Everything is going to be all right.
Richard Hastings stood on the edge of the bridge, his expensive Italian shoes balanced on the cold metal railing, the dark water 40 feet below, calling to him like a siren's song. He'd lost everything. His company, his mansion, his wife, his reputation, his reason to live. One step forward, and it would all be over. No more pain, no more shame. No more waking up to face another day of being the man who'd fallen from billionaire to bankrupt in 6 catastrophic months. The wind whipped around him, and Richard closed his eyes, preparing to jump. But then he heard a voice, a young voice, a child's voice, that cut through his despair like a knife through butter. "Mister, if you jump, you'll miss the best part." Richard's eyes snapped open. Standing on the bridge behind him was a little girl, maybe 7 years old, with dark skin, bright eyes, and the most confident expression Richard had ever seen on a child. She wore a worn-out pink jacket and scuffed sneakers, and she was looking at him like he was the one who needed help, not her. "The best part of what?" Richard asked, his voice rough, from weeks of not talking to anyone. "Of your story," the little girl said simply. "Every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. You're only in the middle. If you jump now, you'll never know how it ends. And mister, I bet your ending is going to be amazing." Richard stared at this child who'd appeared out of nowhere, speaking wisdom that seemed impossible from someone so young. "Who are you? Where did you come from?" The girl smiled. "I'm Keisha. My mama cleans houses. She used to clean yours, actually, before you lost it. She talks about you sometimes. Says you were always kind to her. Says you treated her like a person, not just a maid. Says the world needs more people like you in it." Richard felt something crack inside his chest. The maid. He remembered her. A kind woman named Dorothy, who'd worked for him for 3 years, who'd always had a smile and a gentle word, who'd lost her job when Richard had to let all his staff go, and this was her daughter. "Keisha, you shouldn't be out here alone. Where's your mother?" "Working a double shift at the hospital, cleaning floors. I'm supposed to be at my neighbor's house, but I saw you from the bus window and I knew what you were thinking about doing. So I got off the bus and came to stop you." Keisha stepped closer, her small hand reaching out. "Please come down from there, mister. Please. My mama says every life matters." Even when we think it doesn't. Especially then. Richard looked at this child, this beautiful, brave child who'd gotten off a bus to save a stranger, who'd risked her own safety to talk down a man on the edge of ending his life. And suddenly, jumping seemed like the most selfish thing he could possibly do. "Okay," Richard said quietly. "Okay, I'll come down." He climbed back over the railing, his legs shaking so badly he almost fell anyway. Keisha grabbed his hand with both of hers, steadying him, and Richard realized this 7-year-old girl was stronger than he'd been in months. But what Richard didn't know yet, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was that this moment on the bridge was just the beginning. That Keisha's simple act of kindness would set off a chain of events that would not only save Richard's life, but transform it completely. That the maid's daughter who'd stopped him from jumping would become the catalyst for the most incredible comeback story anyone had ever seen. And what neither Richard nor Keisha knew was that someone had been watching them on the bridge. Someone with a camera. Someone who'd filmed the entire encounter and was about to post it online with a caption that would make Richard Hastings' face recognizable to millions of people overnight. The video would go viral in 3 hours. Richard's life would change again in 6. And by tomorrow morning, the bankrupt billionaire and the maid's daughter would be at the center of a storm neither of them could have predicted. But first, Richard had to figure out how to get this 7-year-old girl safely home. And in doing so, he was about to learn a lesson about wealth, poverty, and what it really meant to have something worth living for. 6 months earlier, Richard Hastings had been living what most people would call a perfect life. At 42 years old, he'd built a real estate investment company worth $800 million. He lived in a 12,000-square-foot mansion with his wife Catherine and their 2 teenage sons, Brandon and Tyler. He drove a different luxury car every day of the week. His vacation home in the Hamptons had been featured in architectural magazines. Richard had grown up poor, the son of a single mother who'd worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table. He'd put himself through college with scholarships and student loans. He'd built his company from nothing, starting with a single rental property he'd bought with borrowed money and turning it into an empire, the American dream personified. Rags to riches. Proof that hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle. But somewhere along the way to building his fortune, Richard had forgotten where he came from, had started to believe that his success was purely his own doing, not the result of luck and timing and help from countless people, had begun to think that being rich made him better than other people, smarter, more deserving. His wife Catherine had grown up wealthy, and she'd encouraged Richard's transformation from humble beginnings to arrogant elite. She'd pushed him to buy the mansion, the cars, the vacation homes. She'd insisted they join the right country clubs, attend the right charity galas, send their sons to the most expensive private schools. And Richard had gone along with it all, believing that accumulating more wealth and status would somehow fill the emptiness he felt inside. The truth was, Richard had been miserable for years. He worked 16-hour days, rarely saw his sons, had a marriage that existed more on paper than in reality. He had everything money could buy and nothing that actually mattered, but he'd been too proud and too blind to admit it. Then came the scandal that destroyed everything. One of Richard's business partners, a man named Gerald Winters, had been running a massive fraud scheme. Gerald had been inflating property values, lying to investors, cooking the books to hide millions in losses. And when federal investigators started digging, they found Richard's signature on documents that made him look complicit in the fraud. Richard had been innocent. He'd signed papers without reading them carefully, trusting Gerald to handle the details. But innocent didn't matter when the media got hold of the story. The headline screamed, "Billionaire real estate mogul faces federal fraud charges." Investors pulled their money. Business partners abandoned ship. Banks called in loans. The whole empire collapsed in a matter of weeks. Richard was never formally charged with a crime. Investigators eventually concluded he'd been negligent but not criminal. But the damage was done. His company went bankrupt. His assets were seized to pay creditors. His reputation was destroyed. And worst of all, his family abandoned him. Catherine had filed for divorce the moment the scandal broke. She'd taken the boys and moved to her parents' estate in Connecticut, telling Richard she wasn't going to let his mistakes destroy her life and their sons' futures. The divorce papers arrived the same day Richard had to move out of his mansion, adding humiliation to devastation. Brandon and Tyler, his teenage sons, who Richard had worked so hard to give a better life than he'd had, refused to speak to him. They were embarrassed by the scandal, ashamed to have Richard Hastings as their father. They'd grown up entitled and spoiled, and now they blamed Richard for threatening their comfortable lifestyle. Within 3 months, Richard had gone from billionaire to bankrupt, from family man to alone, from respected businessman to social pariah. He'd moved into a cheap apartment in a bad neighborhood. He'd sold everything he could to pay lawyers and settle debts. He'd applied for job after job, but no one wanted to hire the disgraced former billionaire. The loneliness was crushing. Richard would go days without speaking to another person. He'd sit in his tiny apartment, surrounded by the few possessions he had left, wondering how his life had fallen apart so completely. He'd lost his business, but that was just money. He'd lost his family, and that felt like losing his soul. Depression settled over Richard like a heavy blanket. He stopped eating regularly, stopped sleeping more than a few hours a night, stopped seeing any point in continuing to exist in a world where everything he'd worked for had disappeared and everyone he'd loved had abandoned him. That's what had led him to the bridge on that cold November evening. The absolute certainty that his life was over, that he had nothing left to live for, that ending it all would be easier than facing another day of emptiness and shame. But then Keisha had appeared. This small, brave child who'd seen him preparing to jump and had cared enough to try to stop him, who'd spoken words of wisdom that seemed impossible from someone so young, who'd reminded Richard of something he'd forgotten in his years of chasing wealth and status, that simple human kindness mattered more than any amount of money. Now, Standing on solid ground, with Keisha's small hand still gripping his, Richard felt something he hadn't felt in months. Not happiness, exactly, but maybe the tiniest spark of hope. The smallest possibility that maybe his story wasn't over yet. "Are you okay now?" Keisha asked, looking up at him with concerned eyes. "You're not going to try to jump again, are you?" "No," Richard said, and he meant it. "I'm not going to jump. Thank you, Keisha. You saved my life." "Good," Keisha said matter-of-factly, "because like I said, you need to stick around for the good ending. And also, because my mama would be sad if something happened to you. She liked working for you. Said you were one of the nice ones." Richard felt his eyes burning with tears. Dorothy, the maid who'd cleaned his mansion for 3 years, had thought he was nice, even though he'd been so wrapped up in his own problems that he'd barely noticed her as a person. Even though he'd let her go without much thought when he had to cut his staff, she'd still remembered him kindly, and her daughter had risked her safety to save him. "I need to get you home," Richard said, suddenly aware that it was getting dark and this child was alone with him. "Your mother will be worried. Where do you live?" "Parkview Apartments, Building C. But I told you, Mama's working a double shift. She won't be home until midnight." Keisha looked uncertain for the first time. "I'm supposed to be at Mrs. Chen's apartment, but I left without telling her. She's probably worried." Richard pulled out his phone, one of the few possessions he still owned. "Let's call her. Let her know you're safe. Then I'll take you back." They called Mrs. Chen, Keisha's elderly neighbor, who watched her when Dorothy worked late shifts. Mrs. Chen was indeed worried, having discovered Keisha missing 20 minutes ago and about to call the police. Richard explained that Keisha was safe and he was bringing her home, leaving out the part about why they were together. The walk to Parkview Apartments took 30 minutes. Richard could have called an Uber, but he barely had money for food, let alone rides. Keisha chattered the entire way, telling Richard about school, her friends, her dreams of becoming a doctor someday. She talked about her mother with such obvious love and pride that Richard felt ashamed of how he'd taken his own family for granted. "Mama works so hard," Keisha said as they walked. "She cleans houses during the day and the hospital at night. She's always tired, but she never complains. She says we're lucky because we have each other, and we have enough. Even though we don't have much, we have enough. That's what she always says." Richard thought about his mansion, his luxury cars, his expensive lifestyle that had never made him happy. Dorothy and Keisha lived in a tiny apartment and barely got by. But they had something Richard had lost: gratitude, appreciation for what they had, instead of constantly wanting more. Parkview Apartments was exactly the kind of place Richard's old self would have driven past without noticing. Run-down buildings with peeling paint, broken playground equipment, cars with missing parts in the parking lot. This was the world Richard had escaped from as a young man and had spent decades trying to forget existed. But now, walking through the complex with Keisha's hand in his, Richard saw it differently. He saw kids playing together, sharing toys even though none of them had much. He saw neighbors greeting each other, looking out for one another. He saw community in a way that had never existed in his gated mansion neighborhood where everyone lived behind high walls and nobody knew their neighbors' names. Mrs. Chen met them at the door of her apartment, a tiny elderly Asian woman with a fierce expression. She hugged Keisha tightly, then looked at Richard with suspicion. "Who are you? Why was Keisha with you?" Richard explained carefully, leaving out the bridge incident. "I knew Dorothy. She used to work for me. I ran into Keisha and walked her home to make sure she was safe." Mrs. Chen's expression softened slightly. "Dorothy speaks well of you. Says you were always respectful, not like some of the people she works for now." She looked at Richard more carefully. "You're the one who lost everything, aren't you?" "I recognize you from the news." Richard nodded, shame washing over him. Even here, in this neighborhood so different from his old world, people knew about his fall from grace. But Mrs. Chen surprised him. Instead of judgment, her face showed sympathy. "Losing everything is hard. I know. I lost my husband, my restaurant, My savings all in 1 year. Thought I couldn't survive. But here I am, still breathing, still helping others, still finding reasons to smile. You'll survive too, Mr. Hastings. The fall hurts, but it doesn't have to be the end. Richard felt something crack open inside his chest. This woman who had so little was offering him comfort and hope. "Thank you," he managed to say. Keisha hugged him before going inside. "Remember what I said, Mr. Richard. You have to stay for the good ending. Promise me." "I promise," Richard said, and he meant it. He walked back toward his apartment as darkness fell, his mind churning with thoughts and feelings he hadn't allowed himself to experience in months. Keisha had saved his life. But more than that, she'd reminded him of something essential. That kindness existed. That people cared. That even in his lowest moment, when he thought he had nothing, he could still make a difference just by staying alive. Richard didn't know that someone had filmed his conversation with Keisha on the bridge. Didn't know that in a few hours, that video would be everywhere. Didn't know that the world was about to see him at his most vulnerable and desperate. And he definitely didn't know that the video would change everything. Again, Richard got back to his small apartment and collapsed on his worn-out couch. For the first time in months, he felt like maybe he could sleep without nightmares. Keisha's words kept echoing in his mind. "You're only in the middle. If you jump now, you'll never know how it ends." What would his ending be? Richard had no idea. He had no money, no job, no family, no prospects. But he was alive. And apparently, according to a 7-year-old girl who'd saved him, that mattered. Richard made himself a simple dinner of canned soup and stale bread. Ate it sitting at his small kitchen table, thinking about Dorothy and Keisha eating similar meals in their tiny apartment. Thinking about how he'd lived in luxury for years without appreciating it, while people like them struggled every day and still found reasons to be grateful. He was washing his dish when his phone started buzzing. Then buzzing again. And again. Within minutes, his phone was exploding with notifications. Calls from numbers he didn't recognize. Text messages from people he hadn't heard from in months. Social media notifications by the hundreds. Confused, Richard opened his phone and saw what everyone was sending him. A video, posted 3 hours ago, already viewed millions of times. The caption read, "Bankrupt billionaire saved from suicide by 7-year-old girl. This will restore your faith in humanity." Richard's hands shook as he watched the video. Someone had filmed him on the bridge, had captured Keisha approaching him, had recorded their entire conversation, though the audio was faint and hard to hear. But the image was clear. Richard balanced on the railing, ready to jump. Keisha talking him down. Richard climbing back to safety. His most desperate, vulnerable moment, now viewed by millions of strangers. Richard felt sick. This was his privacy, his pain, his lowest point exposed to the entire world. The comments on the video were overwhelming. Some people called him selfish for trying to jump. Others praised Keisha for her bravery. Still others criticized Richard for putting a child in a position where she felt she had to save an adult. But many comments were different, supportive, kind. People sharing their own stories of depression and suicidal thoughts. People saying they understood what Richard was going through. People thanking Keisha for reminding everyone that simple kindness could save lives. Richard's phone rang. A number he didn't recognize, but he answered anyway. "Mr. Hastings? This is Jennifer Walsh from Good Morning America. We'd love to interview you and the little girl from the video. Your story is incredibly powerful, and we think it could help a lot of people. Would you be interested?" Richard hung up without answering. Then his phone rang again. And again. News outlets. Talk shows. Podcasts. Everyone wanted to talk to the bankrupt billionaire and the maid's daughter who'd saved him. Richard turned off his phone and sat in the silence of his apartment, trying to process what was happening. The video had exposed his worst moment, but it was also making people pay attention to him for the first time in months. Not as a fraud or a failure, but as a human being struggling with real problems. What should he do? Hide from the attention? Embrace it? Use it somehow? Richard thought about Keisha's words. Every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. You're only in the middle. Maybe she was right. Maybe this wasn't the end of his story. Maybe it was just a painful middle chapter, and what came next was up to him. Richard made a decision. Tomorrow, he would find Dorothy and Keisha. He would thank them properly. He would figure out how to handle the sudden media attention. He would start trying to rebuild not his fortune, but his life, the things that actually mattered. But first, he needed to sleep. For the first time in 6 months, Richard went to bed with something resembling hope, not certainty, not confidence. Just the tiny spark of possibility that maybe, just maybe, his story could still have a good ending. He fell asleep thinking about a 7-year-old girl who'd been brave enough to save a stranger, who'd reminded him that every life mattered, who'd given him a reason to stay alive when he'd been ready to give up completely. What Richard didn't know was that tomorrow would bring changes he couldn't imagine, that the video of him on the bridge would trigger a sequence of events that would test him in new ways, that his relationship with Dorothy and Keisha was about to become complicated in ways none of them expected, that people from his past were about to reappear with agendas of their own, that his story was far from over. The night passed quietly. Morning came, and with it, everything changed. Richard woke to someone pounding on his apartment door. Disoriented, he stumbled out of bed and looked through the peephole. A crowd of people with cameras stood outside. Reporters, journalists, all wanting to talk to him about the bridge incident. "Mr. Hastings, can you tell us what you were feeling on that bridge?" "Mr. Hastings, how does it feel to be saved by a child?" "Mr. Hastings, are you getting help for your depression?" Richard backed away from the door, his heart pounding. This was too much, too fast. He wasn't ready to face the world yet, wasn't ready to become a story, an example, a lesson. His phone, which he'd turned back on, showed hundreds more messages. But one stood out. A text from a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Richard, this is Dorothy, Keisha's mom. We need to talk. The reporters are at our apartment too. Please call me." Richard called immediately. Dorothy answered on the first ring, her voice strained. "Mr. Hastings, I don't know what to do. Keisha told me what happened on the bridge. I'm so glad she found you. But now all these people are here wanting to interview her, take her picture, tell her story. It's overwhelming. She's just a little girl. This is too much attention." "I know," Richard said. "I'm sorry. I never wanted this. Someone must have filmed us and posted it online." "I'm not blaming you," Dorothy said quickly. "I just don't know how to protect Keisha from all of this. She thinks it's exciting now. But what happens when the reporters lose interest and move on to the next story? What happens to a 7-year-old who's been made into a viral sensation?" Richard understood her concern. This kind of attention could be damaging, especially for a child. What if we gave one interview? Together. You, me, and Keisha. We tell our story on our terms, and then we ask everyone else to leave us alone. Would that work? Dorothy was quiet for a moment. "Let me think about it. But Mr. Hastings, there's something else. People are sending money. To me. To Keisha. Strangers who saw the video and want to help the heroic little girl and her struggling single mother. There's already over $50,000 in donations to a GoFundMe someone set up without asking. Me. I don't know what to do with it. It feels wrong to take money just because my daughter was kind to someone. $50,000. For Dorothy and Keisha, that was life-changing money. For Richard's old self, it had been pocket change. The contrast made him feel sick about how he'd lived for so many years. "That money belongs to you and Keisha," Richard said firmly. "Your daughter saved my life. If people want to thank her by helping your family, that's their choice. Take the money, Dorothy. Use it to make your lives easier. You deserve it." "I don't know," Dorothy said uncertainly. "It doesn't feel right." Before Richard could respond, there was a crash outside his apartment, shouting, the sound of something breaking. Richard looked through the peephole and saw the crowd of reporters had grown larger. Building security was trying to control them, but it was chaos. "I have to go," Richard told Dorothy. "But please, think about what I said, about the interview and about the money. I'll call you later." Richard hung up and tried to figure out how to escape his apartment without being mobbed by reporters. The irony wasn't lost on him. 6 months ago, reporters had hounded him about the fraud scandal. Now they were hounding him about being saved from suicide. Different story, same circus. Then his phone rang again. This time, the name on the screen made Richard's heart stop. Catherine, his ex-wife. The woman who'd abandoned him the moment his fortune disappeared. Richard stared at the phone, debating whether to answer. Finally, curiosity won. "Hello, Catherine." "Richard." Her voice was smooth, controlled. The same voice she'd used when telling him she wanted a divorce. "I saw the video. We need to talk." "We don't need to do anything," Richard said coldly. "You made it very clear 6 months ago that you wanted nothing to do with me." "I made a mistake," Catherine said, which was probably the first time she'd admitted being wrong about anything in her entire life. "I was scared, and I reacted poorly. But Richard, I'm still your wife." "Technically. The divorce isn't final yet, and I think we should reconsider." Richard couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Let me get this straight. When I lost my money, you left immediately. Now that I'm getting sympathetic media attention, you want to reconcile?" "Do you hear how that sounds?" "It's not about the attention," Catherine protested, though her tone suggested it absolutely was. "It's about our family. Brandon and Tyler miss you. They want to see you. And I miss you too. We made vows, Richard. For better or worse. Maybe I left during the worse, but I want to be here for the better now." Richard laughed bitterly. "There is no better, Catherine. I'm still broke. I still have no company. I still have nothing but a viral video and a cheap apartment. If you're thinking I'm about to cash in on this attention and rebuild my fortune, you're wrong. And even if I did, I wouldn't take you back. You showed me who you are when things got hard. I won't forget that." "You're being unreasonable," Catherine said, her voice sharp now. "Think about our sons. They need their father." "They needed their father 6 months ago, when you took them away. Where's this concern coming from now?" "Oh, right, I'm famous again. In a sympathetic way. That's useful to you." Catherine's mask dropped completely. "Fine. You want to be difficult? Then you can deal with the consequences. Those reporters outside your door? I could make them go away. I have connections, lawyers, public relations people. But I'm only willing to help if you're willing to work with me on this divorce. Give me what I'm asking for in the settlement, or I'll make sure this media circus destroys you all over again." Richard felt cold fury wash over him. "Are you actually threatening me right now, after everything you've already done?" "I'm protecting my interests," Catherine said coolly. "Something you should have done before you signed all those papers with Gerald. Maybe if you'd been smarter, we wouldn't be in this situation." Richard hung up on her. His hands were shaking with anger and something else. Relief. Because hearing Catherine's true motives so clearly exposed made Richard realize something important. Losing her wasn't a tragedy. It was a blessing. She'd never loved him. She'd loved his money and status. Without those things, he was worthless to her. But he wasn't worthless. Keisha had proven that. A 7-year-old girl had seen value in Richard's life when Richard himself couldn't. She'd cared about a stranger because caring was the right thing to do, not because of what she could get from him. That was real kindness, real humanity. Everything Richard's marriage had lacked. His phone rang again. This time, it was a number he recognized. His lawyer, Dennis Crawford. "Richard, we have a problem. Catherine is pushing for an expedited divorce, and she's making some outrageous demands. She wants half of any future earnings you might make, including anything from media deals related to this bridge incident. She's claiming that your emotional distress qualifies you for disability, which means you'll need to pay her support. And she's threatening to fight for full custody of the boys, with no visitation rights for you if you don't agree to her terms." Richard sank into his couch. "Can she do that?" "She can try. Whether she'll succeed is another question. But Richard, fighting this will cost money you don't have. Catherine knows that. She's betting you'll give in rather than face a long legal battle." "Then she's betting wrong," Richard said firmly. "I won't give her anything. She walked away from me." She doesn't get to come back now and take whatever scraps she thinks I might earn. Fight her, Dennis. On everything. I don't care what it costs. Richard, I appreciate the sentiment, but my fees alone will be paid somehow, Richard interrupted. Maybe I'll do some of those media interviews. Maybe I'll figure something else out. But I'm not giving Catherine what she wants just because it's easier. Some things are worth fighting for. After Dennis hung up, promising to push back on Catherine's demands, Richard sat in his apartment and thought about his situation. He had no money, an ex-wife trying to extort him. A media circus camped outside his door. A viral video that had exposed his most vulnerable moment. And somehow, despite all of that, he felt more alive than he had in years. Because for the first time since his company collapsed, Richard had something to fight for. Not wealth or status, but something more important. Dignity, truth, the right to live his life on his own terms instead of being manipulated by people who only valued him for what they could take from him. And he had something else too, a connection to Dorothy and Keisha, two people who'd shown him what real generosity looked like, who'd reminded him that kindness wasn't about money or power, but about seeing other people's humanity and choosing to help. Richard looked at his phone, at all the interview requests and messages, made a decision. He would do one interview, not to cash in or become famous, but to tell the truth about depression, about hitting rock bottom, about being saved by unexpected kindness. If his story could help even one person the way Keisha had helped him, it would be worth the discomfort of public exposure. But first, he needed to talk to Dorothy and get her permission. This wasn't just his story, it was Keisha's too. And unlike Catherine, unlike the reporters, unlike everyone else trying to use this situation for their own benefit, Richard was going to respect Dorothy's wishes about how her daughter was portrayed. Richard looked at the crowd of reporters still outside his building, visible through his window. He couldn't leave through the front door. But there was a back exit, a fire escape that led to the alley. If he was careful, he could slip out unnoticed. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the back of the building. Climbed down the rusty fire escape, his heart pounding, feeling like a criminal escaping a crime scene. Made it to the alley and walked quickly away from his building toward the bus stop. Richard was going to Parkview Apartments. Going to talk to Dorothy face to face. Going to thank Keisha properly for saving his life. Going to figure out together how to handle the storm that had erupted around them. What Richard didn't know was that the storm was about to get much, much worse. That forces were already in motion that would test everything he'd learned. That his decision to stand up to Catherine was about to trigger consequences he couldn't imagine. That the simple act of Keisha saving him on the bridge had set off a chain reaction that would change multiple lives in ways no one could predict. The bus ride to Parkview Apartments took 40 minutes. Richard sat in the back, wearing a baseball cap he'd found in his closet, trying to be invisible. A few people looked at him curiously, but no one approached. Maybe they didn't recognize him without his expensive clothes and confident bearing. Or maybe they did recognize him, but chose to give him privacy. When Richard arrived at Dorothy's apartment building, he found another crowd of reporters camped outside. Smaller than the one at his building, but still intrusive. He slipped in through a side entrance before anyone noticed him. Dorothy answered her door almost immediately when Richard knocked. She looked exhausted, stressed, overwhelmed. "Thank God you're here," she said, pulling him inside quickly. "This has been insane. Keisha thinks it's all very exciting, but I'm terrified about what this means for her, for us." Richard found himself in a small, tidy apartment that was maybe a tenth the size of his old mansion. But it was clean, warm, filled with love. Photos on every surface, children's drawings on the refrigerator, a sense of home that Richard's mansion had never had despite costing millions. Keisha came running out of her bedroom when she heard Richard's voice. "Mr. Richard, you came to visit. Did you see? We're famous. Everyone wants to talk to me about saving you." Dorothy gave Richard a look that said, "See what I'm dealing with?" Richard knelt down to Keisha's level. "Hey, Keisha, can I talk to you about something important?" "Sure." She sat on the worn couch, looking at him expectantly. "You saved my life on that bridge. You were incredibly brave. But someone filmed us without asking permission, and now our private moment is all over the internet. How do you feel about that?" Keisha thought about this seriously. "I guess I feel okay, because maybe if other sad people see the video, they'll remember that every story has a good ending, and they'll stay alive to find out what theirs is." Richard felt his throat tighten. This child was wiser than most adults he'd known. That's a beautiful way to think about it. But Keisha, all these reporters wanting to interview you, all this attention, it might not last. People might get interested in your story for a little while and then forget about you. Would that hurt your feelings? "Nope," Keisha said confidently. "Because I didn't save you to be famous. I saved you because it was the right thing to do. My mama always says you do the right thing even when nobody's watching. So it doesn't matter if people pay attention or not. I know I did something good. That's enough." Dorothy was crying quietly, proud of her daughter's wisdom and maturity. Richard felt something shift inside his chest. This was what real values looked like. What good parenting produced. Not entitled teenagers who abandoned their father when he lost his money, but a child who understood that doing right mattered more than recognition. "Your daughter is amazing," Richard told Dorothy. "You've raised her beautifully." End quote. End quote. "Thank you," Dorothy said, wiping her eyes. "But Mr. Hastings, please, call me Richard." "Richard then. What do we do about all of this? The reporters, the attention, the money people keep sending? I've never dealt with anything like this before." Richard thought carefully. "Here's what I suggest. We give one interview, together, to someone reputable who will tell our story respectfully. We explain what happened, thank people for their concern, and ask for privacy going forward. We accept the money that's been donated, because Keisha genuinely helped someone, and people want to thank her for it. And then, we try to move forward with our lives as normally as possible." "What about your ex-wife?" Dorothy asked, surprising Richard. "Keisha told me about overhearing reporters talking. They said your wife left you when you lost your money but now wants to come back because you're getting attention again." Richard felt ashamed that Dorothy and Keisha knew about Catherine's opportunism. Catherine is complicated. She's not a good person. I'm realizing that now. But she's also not your problem. I'll handle her. She is our problem if she's trying to use this situation to hurt you, Dorothy said firmly. "Richard, you've been through enough. You deserve better than someone who only values you when you're useful to her." Richard was moved by Dorothy's protective instinct. She barely knew him, and yet she cared about his well-being. "Thank you. That means more than you know." They spent the next hour discussing their options. Finally, they agreed to do an interview with a morning show known for respectful, thoughtful journalism. Dorothy called the producer, explained their conditions. They'd tell their story once, ask for privacy afterward, and would not participate in any sensational or exploitative coverage. The producer agreed immediately. The interview was scheduled for 2 days from now. As Richard prepared to leave, Keisha hugged him tightly. "I'm glad you kept your promise, Mr. Richard, about staying for the good ending. And I think your good ending is going to be really, really good. I can feel it." "I hope you're right," Richard said, hugging her back. He slipped out of the building through the same side entrance, avoiding the reporters. But as he walked toward the bus stop, someone stepped out of a car and blocked his path. Gerald Winters, his former business partner, the man whose fraud had destroyed Richard's company and reputation. "Richard," Gerald said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "we need to talk." Richard felt ice water in his veins. "I have nothing to say to you. You destroyed my life." "Actually, I think I saved it," Gerald said calmly. "You were miserable before the scandal, trapped in a marriage to a woman who didn't love you, building an empire that made you no money but no joy. I did you a favor by blowing it all up." "You went to prison for fraud," Richard said, his voice shaking with anger. "You stole from investors. You lied to everyone. And you tried to make it look like I was involved." "I served 18 months in a minimum security facility," Gerald corrected. "Hardly prison. And yes, I made some poor choices, but I've paid my debt to society. Now I'm out. I'm rebuilding, and I'm here to make you an offer. I don't want anything from you." "You haven't heard the offer yet," Gerald said smoothly. You're famous again, Richard. Sympathetic. People root for a comeback story. That's valuable. I've lined up investors who want to back a new venture with you as the face of it. We split the profits 50-50. You get back on your feet. Everyone wins. Richard stared at Gerald in disbelief. You think I'd ever work with you again? After what you did? I think you'll work with whoever can help you, Gerald said, because right now you're broke. Your wife is bleeding you dry in divorce court. You have no prospects. But you have something valuable. A compelling story and public sympathy. Let me help you monetize that. I'm not monetizing anything, Richard said. And I'm certainly not working with you. Get away from me. Gerald's smile dropped. You're making a mistake. I'm offering you a lifeline. Turn me down, and you'll regret it. I regret ever knowing you, Richard said. That's the only regret I have, where you're concerned. In the regret I have, where you're concerned. In the regret I have, where you're concerned. I regret I have, where you're concerned. He pushed past Gerald and got on the bus that had just arrived. Through the window, he watched Gerald standing on the sidewalk, his expression dark with anger. Another threat, another complication, another person trying to use Richard for their own benefit. But this time, Richard wasn't going to be manipulated. He'd learned his lesson about trusting the wrong people, about sacrificing his values for success, about choosing wealth over integrity. The old Richard would have considered Gerald's offer, would have weighed the potential profit against the moral cost, would have found a way to justify working with a man who'd betrayed him if it meant regaining his fortune. The new Richard, the one who'd been saved by a 7-year-old's kindness, knew better. Some things weren't worth any amount of money. Dignity, honesty, self-respect. Those things, once sold, couldn't be bought back. Richard rode the bus back to his apartment, thinking about the interview in 2 days, about Dorothy's strength and Keisha's wisdom, about Catherine's manipulations and Gerald's threats, about the strange position he found himself in. Famous, but broke. Sympathetic, but struggling. Given a second chance at life, but not sure what to do with it. Keisha was right. He was still in the middle of his story. But what would the ending be? Richard didn't know. But for the first time in 6 months, he was willing to stick around to find out. When Richard got back to his apartment building, the crowd of reporters had mostly dispersed. Only a few stragglers remained, and they didn't try to stop him as he entered through the front door. Inside his apartment, Richard sat in the darkness and thought about everything that had happened since yesterday evening. 24 hours ago, he'd been standing on a bridge, ready to end his life. Now, he was preparing for a national television interview, fighting off his ex-wife's extortion attempt and rejecting corrupt business offers. His phone buzzed. A text from Dennis, his lawyer. Catherine has filed an emergency motion claiming you're mentally unfit to see the boys due to the suicide attempt. Court hearing scheduled for next week. We need to prepare. Richard closed his eyes. Of course, Catherine would use his lowest moment as a weapon against him. Of course, she'd try to take away even the possibility of seeing Brandon and Tyler. Of course, she'd twist his pain into another way to control and hurt him. But Richard had something now that he hadn't had before. He had Dorothy and Keisha showing him what real kindness looked like. He had a second chance at life that he was determined not to waste. He had a story that might help others facing similar struggles. And he had anger. Good, clean, righteous anger at people who tried to profit from others' pain, at a system that let people like Gerald commit fraud and serve minimal time, at a society that measured worth in dollars instead of character. That anger, properly channeled, could be powerful, could be motivating, could be the fuel Richard needed to fight back against everyone trying to use him. Richard made a list on his phone. Do the interview with Dorothy and Keisha Mox. Fight Catherine's custody motion. Figure out how to earn money honestly. Find a therapist to help with depression. Rebuild relationships with Brandon and Tyler if possible. Never forget why Keisha saved him. That last point was the most important. Keisha had seen value in Richard's life when he couldn't. She'd reminded him that his story wasn't over. She'd given him a reason to keep living. Richard wouldn't waste that gift. He'd honor it by becoming the kind of person Keisha believed he could be. Someone who used his second chance wisely. Someone who chose integrity over wealth. Someone who remembered where he came from and helped others who were struggling. The old Richard was gone. The billionaire who'd chased money and status at the expense of everything else. That version of himself had died on the bridge, even though his body had survived. A new Richard was being born. One who understood what actually mattered. One who'd learned through pain and loss what couldn't be learned through success. One who had a 7-year-old girl to thank for the chance to become someone better. Richard went to bed that night with purpose for the first time in months. Tomorrow he'd prepare for the interview. He'd call his sons, even though they probably wouldn't answer. He'd start looking for legitimate work. He'd begin rebuilding a life worth living. But none of that would happen, because tomorrow, something would occur that would shatter Richard's fragile new hope into a million pieces. Something involving Keisha. Something terrible. Something that would test whether Richard's transformation was real or just another story he was telling himself. The worst was yet to come. And when it arrived, Richard would have to choose. Run away, like he'd done before, or stand and fight for someone other than himself. His choice would determine not just his ending, but Keisha's too. Richard woke up to his phone ringing at 6 in the morning. He fumbled for it in the darkness, his heart already pounding, because nothing good ever came from early morning calls. "Mr. Hastings?" A voice he didn't recognize. Female, official sounding. "This is Detective Laura Martinez with the City Police Department. I'm calling about Keisha Washington. She's been in an accident." Richard's world stopped. What? What kind of accident? Is she okay? "She's alive, but she's in critical condition at City General Hospital. Her mother Dorothy is with her. Dorothy asked me to call you. She said you'd want to know." The detective paused. "Mr. Hastings, this wasn't an accident. Someone ran Keisha down deliberately. We're treating this as attempted murder." Richard couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Keisha, the brave little girl who'd saved his life just yesterday, had been deliberately hurt. Someone had tried to kill a 7-year-old child. "I'm coming to the hospital right now," Richard said, already getting dressed with one hand while holding the phone with the other. "Who did this? Do you know who hurt her?" "We're investigating. But Mr. Hastings, we need to ask you some questions too. The driver fled the scene, but witnesses said it looked intentional." The car drove up onto the sidewalk where Keisha was walking to school, aimed directly at her. Someone wanted to hurt that little girl specifically, and we need to figure out why. Richard's mind raced through terrible possibilities. "Do you think this has something to do with the viral video, with all the attention she's been getting?" "That's one theory," Detective Martinez said carefully. "We're also looking into whether this could be connected to you. You've made some enemies recently, Mr. Hastings. People who might want to hurt you by hurting someone you care about." The guilt hit Richard like a physical blow. This was his fault. Keisha had saved him, had become famous for saving him, and now someone had tried to kill her because of her connection to him. He'd brought danger into her life just by existing. "I'll be at the hospital in 20 minutes, Richard said. "Please, tell Dorothy I'm coming." Richard threw on clothes and ran out of his apartment. No thought about reporters, or privacy, or anything, except getting to Keisha. He didn't have money for an Uber, so he ran to the nearest bus stop, his lungs burning, his mind screaming with fear and guilt. The bus took forever. Richard sat in the back, his leg bouncing with anxiety, checking his phone constantly for updates. Nothing, just the terrible silence of not knowing if a 7-year-old girl was going to live or die. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was really only 30 minutes, Richard burst through the doors of City General Hospital. He found the pediatric intensive care unit and saw Dorothy sitting in the waiting area, her face buried in her hands, her whole body shaking with sobs. "Dorothy," Richard said quietly, sitting beside her. She looked up, and Richard had never seen such pain in anyone's eyes. "They won't let me see her yet. She's in surgery." The car hit her so hard, Richard, broke both her legs, fractured her skull. internal bleeding. The doctors say the next few hours are critical. They don't know if she'll make it. Richard put his arm around Dorothy's shoulders, and she collapsed against him, crying so hard she could barely breathe. This strong, dignified woman who'd raised an incredible daughter while working multiple jobs and never complaining was breaking apart, and Richard felt his own heart shattering along with hers. "This is my fault," Richard said, his voice thick with tears. "If she hadn't saved me, if that video hadn't gone viral, she wouldn't have been targeted. Someone did this because of me. I brought danger to your daughter." Dorothy pulled back and looked at Richard with fierce eyes. Don't you dare blame yourself. Keisha saved you because that's who she is. Kind, brave, caring. She would have done it whether there were cameras or not, whether anyone knew about it or not. That's my baby. That's what I raised her to be. Someone who helps others. "But someone tried to kill her because she helped me," Richard said. "The detective thinks this might be connected to my enemies. People who want to hurt me." Dorothy's expression changed, hardened. "What people? Who would hurt a child to get to you?" Richard thought about Catherine, threatening to destroy him in court. About Gerald, angry that Richard had rejected his business proposal. About Montgomery Pharmaceuticals and all the other companies that had turned on him during the scandal. About the thousands of people who'd lost money when his company collapsed and might blame him for their losses. "I don't know," Richard admitted. "I've made a lot of enemies in the past year, but I never thought any of them would go after a child. This is insane. This is evil." Detective Martinez appeared, her expression grim. "Mr. Hastings, I need to ask you some questions. Can we talk privately?" Richard looked at Dorothy. "I don't want to leave her alone." "Go," Dorothy said firmly. "Answer her questions. Help find who did this to my baby. I'll be okay." Richard followed Detective Martinez to a small consultation room down the hall. She pulled out a notebook and a recording device. "I'm recording this interview with your permission," she said. Richard nodded. "Mr. Hastings, where were you this morning between 7 and 7:30? "Asleep in my apartment, alone. I got your call at 6 and started getting ready to come here, but I didn't leave until after you called." Richard paused. "You think I did this? You think I would hurt Keisha?" "I have to ask," Martinez said. "The timing is suspicious. You meet this girl. She saves your life. The video goes viral. You reconnect with her family. And then 2 days later, someone tries to kill her. I need to rule you out as a suspect." "I would never hurt her," Richard said, his voice breaking. "She saved my life. She gave me a reason to keep living. I would die before I let anything happen to her. But I failed. Someone hurt her anyway. And it's because of me." Martinez studied his face. "I believe you, but we need to figure out who did this. Tell me about your enemies. Anyone who's made threats recently." Richard told her everything. About Catherine's extortion attempt and her emergency custody motion. About Gerald's business proposal and the implied threat when Richard rejected it. About the thousands of angry investors who'd lost money in the scandal. About the reporters who'd been hounding him since the video went viral. "The car that hit Keisha was a black SUV with tinted windows," Martinez said. "We have partial footage from a traffic camera, but the license plate was obscured. The vehicle was reported stolen 2 days ago from a rental company. Professional job. Whoever did this knew what they were doing." "Professional?" Richard felt sick. "You mean someone hired a hitman to kill a 7-year-old girl? That's what it looks like. This wasn't some random attack or a crazy person. This was planned, executed, meant to send a message." Martinez leaned forward. "Mr. Hastings, who wants to send you a message badly enough to hurt an innocent child?" Richard thought hard. Catherine was ruthless, but would she really try to murder a child? Gerald was a fraud and a liar, but was he a killer? Who else had Richard angered enough to trigger this level of violence? Then Richard remembered something. Yesterday, after he'd rejected Gerald's business proposal, Gerald had said, "Turn me down, and you'll regret it." "Gerald Winters," Richard said slowly. "My former business partner, the one who went to prison for fraud. He approached me yesterday with a business proposal. I turned him down. He threatened me, Said I'd regret it. Martinez wrote this down. Where can we find Mr. Winters? With reasoned. I don't know. He just showed up outside Dorothy's apartment building. But detective, would he really hurt a child? Gerald is a lot of things, but I never thought he was violent. People change, Martinez said darkly, especially after prison. We'll bring him in for questioning. She stood up. Mr. Hastings, I need you to stay available. Don't leave town. And be careful. If someone is willing to hurt Keisha to get to you, you might be in danger too. Richard went back to the waiting room, where Dorothy was now joined by Mrs. Chen, the elderly neighbor who watched Keisha after school. Mrs. Chen was crying quietly, holding Dorothy's hand. Any news? Richard asked. Still in surgery, Dorothy said. Her voice was flat now, empty of emotion. Shock, Richard recognized. The same numbness he'd felt when his world had collapsed 6 months ago. The mind's way of protecting itself from unbearable pain. Richard sat down and waited with them. Minutes crawled by like hours. Other families came and went, dealing with their own emergencies. But Richard couldn't focus on anything except Keisha, the brave little girl who'd saved a stranger, who'd reminded Richard that every story could have a good ending. What would Keisha's ending be? Would she survive? And if she did, would she recover fully or be left with permanent damage? Would she be the same joyful, wise child she'd been before, or would this trauma change her forever? Richard's phone buzzed. A text from Dennis, his lawyer. Emergency hearing moved up to tomorrow. Catherine's lawyer claims the suicide attempt and now this incident with the child prove you're dangerous and unstable. They're pushing hard for no contact with Brandon and Tyler. Richard wanted to throw his phone across the room. Catherine was using Keisha's attempted murder as ammunition in their custody battle. Was using a child's suffering to score points in court. The cruelty was breathtaking. But Richard couldn't think about that now. Couldn't worry about Catherine, or the divorce, or seeing his sons. All that mattered was Keisha surviving. Nothing else. 3 hours passed. Then 4. Finally, a surgeon emerged, still wearing his scrubs, his expression carefully neutral in the way doctors learn to be when delivering news that could shatter lives. Dorothy Washington, the surgeon said. Dorothy stood on shaking legs. Yes, that's me. Is my daughter. Keisha is alive, the surgeon said. And Dorothy's legs gave out. Richard and Mrs. Chen caught her, held her up. The surgery went as well as we could hope. We've repaired the internal bleeding and stabilized the skull fracture. Both legs were badly broken, but we've set them with pins and plates. She'll need months of physical therapy, but there's no reason she can't eventually walk normally again. Can I see her? Dorothy asked, tears streaming down her face. She's in recovery now, still unconscious from the anesthesia. But yes, you can see her, just for a few minutes. She needs to rest. The surgeon paused. Miss Washington, your daughter is incredibly lucky. A few inches to the left, and that car would have killed her instantly. As it is, she has a long recovery ahead, but she should make a full physical recovery. What about her brain? Dorothy asked, her voice shaking. You said her skull was fractured. Will there be brain damage? We won't know for certain until she wakes up, but the brain scans look good. No major trauma to the brain itself, just the skull. I'm cautiously optimistic that there won't be lasting cognitive effects. Dorothy sobbed with relief. Richard felt his own tears falling, not caring who saw. Keisha was alive. She would recover. The nightmare wasn't over, but at least there was hope. The surgeon led Dorothy back to see Keisha. She invited Richard to come with her, and he followed, his heart in his throat. Keisha looked so small in the hospital bed, so fragile. Her head was bandaged. Both legs were in casts suspended in traction. Tubes and wires connected her to various machines. Her face was bruised and swollen, but she was breathing, alive, fighting. Dorothy sat beside the bed and took Keisha's small hand in hers. Baby, I'm here. Mama's here. You're going to be okay. You're so strong, so brave, just like when you saved Mr. Richard. You keep fighting, baby. Keep fighting. Richard stood back. not wanting to intrude on this moment between mother and daughter. But his mind was already working. Keisha needed the best care possible, the best doctors, the best physical therapy. Dorothy couldn't afford any of that on her maid's salary. But Richard could find a way. He'd do those media interviews he'd been avoiding. He'd accept speaking fees. He'd do whatever it took to raise money for Keisha's medical expenses. She'd saved his life. Now he'd make sure she had everything she needed to recover from the attack that had happened because of him. Detective Martinez appeared in the doorway. "Miss Washington, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I need to ask Keisha some questions when she wakes up. She's the only witness to the attack. She might have seen the driver or noticed something that could help us catch who did this." "She's 7 years old," Dorothy said fiercely. "She's been through enough. I won't have you traumatizing her further." "I understand," Martinez said gently. "But the person who did this is still out there. They might try again. The sooner we catch them, the sooner Keisha will be safe." Dorothy looked torn. Finally, she nodded. "When she wakes up, not before. And I'll be with her the whole time." "Of course," Martinez agreed. She looked at Richard. "Mr. Hastings, we brought Gerald Winters in for questioning. He has an alibi for this morning. He was at a business breakfast with multiple witnesses. It wasn't him." Richard felt confusion and relief war inside him. Relief that Gerald wasn't a child murderer. Confusion about who else could have done this. Then who? Who would hurt Keisha? "We're still investigating. But Mr. Hastings, I need you to think carefully. Has anyone else made threats? Anyone who might see Keisha as a way to hurt you?" Richard thought hard. Then something occurred to him. The reporters. There's been a media frenzy since the video went viral. What if one of them wanted an even bigger story? What if someone staged an attack to create more drama? Martinez's expression darkened. "That's disturbing, but possible. We've seen journalists do terrible things for a story. I'll look into it." She left, and Richard sank into a chair, exhausted emotionally and physically. Dorothy was still holding Keisha's hand, singing softly to her unconscious daughter. Mrs. Chen sat in the corner, praying in Chinese. Richard's phone buzzed again. Another text from Dennis. "Catherine is giving interviews, claiming you put Keisha in danger with your reckless behavior. She's painting herself as the responsible parent protecting the boys from your chaos. The media is eating it up." Richard read the text twice, feeling rage build in his chest. Catherine was using Keisha's attack to make herself look good, was using a child's suffering for publicity and sympathy in their divorce battle. There had to be a special circle of hell for people like that. Then another text, this one from a number Richard didn't recognize. "You should have taken my offer. This is what happens when you refuse to cooperate. More people will get hurt unless you come work with me. You have 24 hours to change your mind. G." Richard stared at the message. G. Gerald. But Gerald had an alibi. He couldn't have been the one driving the car that hit Keisha, unless he'd hired someone to do it. Unless he'd orchestrated the attack from a distance while making sure he had witnesses to prove his innocence. Richard forwarded the text to Detective Martinez with shaking hands. This was evidence, proof that Gerald was involved somehow, even if he hadn't been driving the car himself. Within minutes, Martinez called him. "We're getting a warrant for Gerald's phone records and bank accounts. If he hired someone to hurt Keisha, we'll find the connection. Mr. Hastings, you did the right thing showing me this." "Just catch him," Richard said. "Catch whoever did this and make sure they can never hurt anyone again." As evening fell, Keisha still hadn't woken up. The doctor said this was normal, that her body needed time to heal, but Dorothy was getting more anxious with every passing hour. Richard went to get coffee for everyone from the hospital cafeteria. When he returned, he found Dorothy standing in the hallway, arguing with a man Richard didn't recognize. "I told you, you're not seeing her," Dorothy was saying, her voice sharp with stress. "I don't care who you are or what you want. My daughter needs rest." "I'm her father," the man said. "I have a right to see my daughter." Richard froze. Keisha's father. Dorothy had never mentioned him. Richard had assumed he wasn't in the picture. "You haven't been her father for 6 years," Dorothy shot back. You walked out when she was a baby. You don't get to show up now because she's famous and play the concerned parent. The man's name was Trevor, Richard would learn later. He'd left Dorothy when Keisha was 1 year old, overwhelmed by the responsibility of fatherhood. He'd paid minimal child support when he remembered to, but otherwise had no contact with his daughter. Now, with Keisha in the news, Trevor had apparently decided to reappear. I made mistakes, Trevor said, but I'm here now. I want to be part of her life. I want to help. Where were you last week? Dorothy demanded. Last month? Last year? Where were you when she needed shoes for school and I was working double shifts to afford them? Where were you on her birthdays? Where were you when she asked why her daddy didn't love her? Trevor's face flushed. I had my own problems. I wasn't ready to be a father. But I'm better now. I have a job, an apartment. I can help with her medical bills. Be there for her recovery. You want to help with medical bills? Dorothy's laugh was bitter. Where's that coming from, Trevor? Because I know you don't have that kind of money. Unless you're planning to profit off her story somehow. Sell interviews about being the absent father who came back. Is that your plan? Trevor's guilty expression answered the question. Richard felt disgust rise in his throat. Another person trying to use Keisha's situation for personal gain. Get out, Dorothy said flatly. Get out, before I call security. You're not seeing her. You're not part of her life. You gave up that right when you walked away. You can't keep me from my own daughter, Trevor protested. I have legal rights. Actually, you don't, a new voice said. A woman in a business suit approached, carrying a briefcase. I'm Amanda Foster, attorney with Family Services. Miss Evrian. Washington contacted me about this situation. Mr. Trevor Washington. You signed away your parental rights 3 years ago when you agreed to terminate child support in exchange for giving up all legal claim to your daughter. That document is on file with the court. You have no legal right to see Keisha. If you don't leave immediately, I'll have you arrested for trespassing. Trevor's face went from red to white. He looked at Dorothy with something that might have been regret or might have been anger. This isn't over, he said. Yes, it is, Dorothy replied. Goodbye, Trevor. Trevor left, and Dorothy sagged against the wall. I can't believe he showed up. After all this time. Just because she's in the news. Amanda Foster put a comforting hand on Dorothy's shoulder. Unfortunately, this happens a lot when children become newsworthy. Absent parents suddenly reappear, trying to claim credit or profit from their child's fame. But legally, he has no standing. The termination of rights was clear and binding. Daughter, Morrow. Daughter, daughter, daughter. Thank you, Dorothy said. I don't know how I'm going to pay for your services, but thank you for coming so quickly. You're not paying, Amanda said. She looked at Richard. Mr. Hastings contacted me. He's covering my fees. Dorothy turned to Richard with tears in her eyes. You did that? Why? Because Keisha saved my life, Richard said simply. And because you're dealing with too much already, you shouldn't have to fight off Trevor and worry about legal bills on top of everything else. Let me help, please. Dorothy hugged Richard tightly. Thank you. Thank you so much. As night fell fully, Richard realized he'd been at the hospital for over 12 hours. He should go home, rest, prepare for tomorrow's emergency custody hearing. But he couldn't leave, couldn't abandon Dorothy and Keisha when they needed support. Around 9 p.m., Keisha finally woke up. Dorothy was holding her hand when Keisha's eyes fluttered open. Mama? Keisha's voice was weak, confused. I'm here, baby. I'm right here. Dorothy was crying and smiling at the same time. How do you feel? Everything hurts, Keisha said. What happened? Why am I in the hospital? You were hit by a car, sweetheart. On your way to school. Do you remember anything about it? Keisha's face scrunched up as she tried to remember. I was walking. Then I heard a car engine, really loud. And when I turned around, the car was coming right at me, on the sidewalk. I tried to run, but I wasn't fast enough. Tears leaked from her eyes. Mama, I was so scared. I know, baby, I know. But you're safe now. You're going to be okay. Detective Martinez, who'd been waiting for Keisha to wake up, approached gently. "Keisha, I'm Detective Martinez. I know you're tired and hurting, but can you tell me anything about the car or the driver? Anything you remember might help us catch the person who did this." Keisha thought hard. The car was black, really shiny, and the windows were dark, so I couldn't see inside. But, she paused, I think I heard something. Before the car hit me, someone shouted, a woman's voice. She yelled, "That's for Richard Hastings." The room went silent. Dorothy looked at Richard with shock. Martinez pulled out her notebook. "You're sure?" Martinez asked. "Someone said Richard Hastings' name?" "I think so," Keisha said. "It happened so fast. But I remember being confused why they said Mr. Richard's name." Richard felt like he'd been stabbed. This confirmed his worst fear. Someone had deliberately hurt Keisha because of her connection to him. Someone who knew about the bridge incident and wanted to punish Richard by attacking a child who'd saved him. "A woman's voice," Martinez repeated. "Are you sure it was a woman?" Keisha nodded. "It sounded like a lady, an angry lady." Martinez looked at Richard. "Mr. Hastings, we need to talk. Now." They went into the hallway. Martinez's expression was grim. "Your ex-wife. Where was she this morning?" Richard's blood turned to ice. "You think Catherine did this? You think she would hurt a child?" "She has motive. She wants to destroy you in the divorce. Attacking someone connected to you would accomplish that while also making you look dangerous to be around. It would support her custody claims." "And you said she's ruthless." "But Catherine isn't violent," Richard protested, even though doubt was creeping into his mind. "She's manipulative and cold, but she's not a killer. She wouldn't hurt a child, would she?" "I've seen people do terrible things in divorces," Martinez said, "especially when a lot of money is involved. We're going to investigate your ex-wife thoroughly. If she's involved, we'll find the evidence." Richard's phone rang. It was Dennis. "Richard, we have a problem. Catherine's emergency custody hearing is in 10 hours. You need to be there. If you don't show up, the judge will rule in her favor by default, and you'll lose all rights to see Brandon and Tyler." "I can't leave the hospital," Richard said. "Keisha just woke up. She needs support." "I understand that. But Richard, if you don't fight for your sons now, you might never get another chance. Catherine's lawyers are painting you as unstable and dangerous. You need to be in that courtroom to defend yourself." Richard looked through the window at Keisha, small and fragile in her hospital bed. Looked at Dorothy, exhausted but still strong. He was needed here, but his sons needed him too, even if they didn't know it yet. "I'll be there," Richard said finally. "But I'm coming back to the hospital as soon as it's over." He went back into Keisha's room. Dorothy looked at him questioningly. "I have to go to court in the morning," Richard explained. "Emergency custody hearing with my ex-wife. But I'll be back as soon as possible, I promise." "Go fight for your boys," Dorothy said. "We'll be okay here." Keisha reached out her small hand. Richard took it gently. "Mr. Richard, I'm sorry someone hurt me because of you. But I'm not sorry I saved you. Even if I could go back and change things, I'd still do it, because you're worth saving." Richard's vision blurred with tears. This child, lying in a hospital bed, with broken bones and a head injury caused by Richard's enemies, was telling him he was worth saving. "You're the bravest person I've ever met," Richard told her. "And when you get out of here, I'm going to make sure you have everything you need. The best doctors, the best therapy, whatever it takes to help you heal." "I just want to walk again," Keisha said. "The doctor said I'll be able to eventually. Do you think that's true?" "I know it's true," Richard said firmly. "You're strong. You're a fighter. You'll walk again. You'll run again. You'll do everything you did before." Keisha smiled weakly. "Okay, I believe you." Richard left the hospital around 10 p.m., his heart heavy with guilt and determination. Guilt that Keisha had been hurt because of him. Determination to make sure everyone responsible paid for what they'd done. The custody hearing was scheduled for 8 a.m. Richard had less than 10 hours to prepare. to figure out how to prove to a judge that he wasn't dangerous, that he deserved to see his sons, that Catherine was the real threat here, not him. But as Richard rode the bus home through the dark city streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get much worse, that Keisha's attack was just the beginning, that someone out there wanted to destroy Richard completely and wouldn't stop until they'd taken everything from him. He didn't know how right he was, because while Richard was preparing for his custody hearing, while Keisha was sleeping in her hospital bed, while Dorothy was keeping vigil by her daughter's side, someone was making plans. Catherine was in her parents' mansion, meeting with lawyers and investigators, planning her strategy for tomorrow's hearing, preparing to paint Richard as unstable and dangerous, getting ready to take his sons away permanently. Gerald was in a luxury hotel room, making phone calls to business associates, calling in favors, preparing his next move, enforcing Richard to work with him, planning something even more terrible than what had already happened. And somewhere in the city, the person who'd driven the black SUV that hit Keisha was watching the news coverage of the attack, pleased with the chaos they'd created, ready to strike again if necessary, waiting for the right moment to finish what they'd started. Richard's life was about to become even more complicated. The custody hearing would bring revelations he wasn't prepared for. Keisha's condition would take an unexpected turn, and the truth about who'd ordered the attack would emerge in the most shocking way possible. But none of that would happen tonight. Tonight, Richard just had to survive, had to prepare, had to find a way to fight for his sons while supporting Dorothy and Keisha, had to become the man Keisha believed he could be, even when everything was falling apart. The city lights blurred past the bus window. Richard's reflection stared back at him, and he barely recognized himself. The billionaire was gone. The suicidal man on the bridge was gone too. In their place was someone new, someone who'd been saved by a child's kindness, someone who had a second chance at life and was determined not to waste it, someone who was about to face his hardest test yet. Tomorrow would bring answers, but it would also bring more questions, more pain, more challenges. The story Keisha had saved was far from over. It was just entering its most difficult chapter. And Richard would have to decide, would he run from the fight or stand and face it? Would he protect himself or protect the people who'd shown him kindness? Would he choose the easy path or the right one? His choice would determine not just his ending, but the endings of everyone connected to him. Dorothy, Keisha, his sons, everyone whose life had become tangled with his through this strange series of events. The bus pulled up to Richard's stop. He got off and walked toward his apartment building, knowing that in a few hours, everything would change again. What he didn't know was just how much, or how quickly, or how devastating the revelations of tomorrow would be. But he'd find out soon enough. The truth was coming, and it would shake Richard's world to its foundations.